The shovel hit something that shouldn't have been there. It was October 2017, and the road crew working along Dry Creek Road had been at it since dawn, widening the narrow stretch of dirt and gravel that wound through the Massachusetts foothills just outside Fitchburg. Routine work, backhoes, dump trucks, the smell of diesel and fresh-turned earth. Nothing unusual, until the foreman's blade scraped fabric. He stopped, knelt down, brushed away the clay with his gloved hand. Wires. Deteriorated material. Something metallic catching the afternoon light. A brass keyring, engraved with 3 letters. DV Locksmithing. The crew went silent. Someone called 911. Within the hour, yellow tape cordoned off the site, and investigators in white suits began the painstaking work of exhuming what had been hidden beneath Massachusetts soil for 19 years. This wasn't supposed to be here, neither was she. Her name was Dianne Vasquez, 26 years old, a skilled locksmith who'd built her own business from the ground up in a trade dominated by men. Reliable, trusted, the kind of person who showed up on time, did the job right, and always called her mother before heading home. On the 15th of October 1998, she drove into these same foothills for what should have been a simple repair call, a lock that needed fixing, a client she'd never met, a location she'd never been to before. She told her mother she'd be back by 5. She never made it home. Her truck was found the next morning, pulled off the road and half hidden in the brush. Purse inside, cash untouched, ID still in her wallet. No signs of struggle, no blood, no witnesses, just silence beneath the smoky mountain fog. For 19 years, her mother kept the porch light on, waiting, hoping, refusing to believe her daughter was gone forever. And then a road crew widening, a forgotten stretch of dirt road struck metal beneath the clay. What investigators uncovered next didn't just solve one of Fitchburg's most haunting missing person cases. It exposed the man who thought he'd buried his guilt deep enough that no one would ever find it. If you're drawn to cases where patience, persistence, and a single piece of evidence finally crack open the truth, hit that subscribe button right now. Because we're about to walk through 19 years of unanswered questions, a mother's unshakable faith, and the moment justice finally clawed its way out of the ground. This is the story of the locksmith who never came home. Before we dive into what happened on that October afternoon in 1998, you need to understand who Dianne Vasquez really was. Because she wasn't just a name in a case file. She wasn't just another statistic in the long list of people who vanish without explanation. She was a daughter, a friend, a businesswoman who'd carved out her own path in a world that didn't always make room for her. Dianne was born in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, in 1972. She grew up in a working-class neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where front doors stayed unlocked and neighbors looked out for each other. Her mother, Rita Vasquez, raised her mostly on her own after Dianne's father left when she was 7. Money was tight, but Rita made sure Dianne never went without. She worked double shifts at the textile mill, came home exhausted, and still found time to help with homework, pack lunches, and show up to every school event. Dianne learned early what it meant to be resilient, to work hard, to depend on yourself. She wasn't the type to follow the crowd. In high school, while other kids were figuring out college applications or planning gap years, Dianne was drawn to something different. She liked working with her hands, solving problems, figuring out how things worked. After graduation, she enrolled in a vocational program and trained as a locksmith. It wasn't a common choice, especially not for a young woman in the late 80s. Locksmiths were usually older men with decades of experience, guys who'd inherited the trade from their fathers or learned it in the military. But Dianne didn't care about convention. She was good at it, really good. She had steady hands, a sharp mind, and the kind of patience that made her perfect for the work. By 1995, at just 23 years old, she'd saved enough to start her own business, DV Locksmithing. She ran it out of a small storefront on Main Street in Fitchburg. The shop was modest, just a desk, a workbench, shelves lined with key blanks and lock cylinders, and a pegboard covered in tools. But it was hers. She answered her own phone, kept her own books, and built her reputation one job at a time. And that reputation? Spotless. People trusted Dianne. She showed up when she said she would. She didn't overcharge. She didn't cut corners. If you locked yourself out of your house at 2 in the morning, Dianne would answer the call and be there within the hour. If your business needed new deadbolts installed, she'd do it right the first time. She became known around Fitchburg as the Locksmith, everyone called. Local businesses kept her number taped to their cash registers. Families recommended her to their neighbors. Even the police department contracted her for lockout assistance. But Dianne wasn't all work and no life. She had friends. She went out on weekends, nothing wild, just dinners, movies, the occasional concert in Boston. She loved classic rock, especially Fleetwood Mac and Tom Petty. She had a dry sense of humor that caught people off guard. She was the type who'd crack a joke while picking a lock, making small talk to put nervous clients at ease. And she was close with her mother. Incredibly close. Rita and Dianne talked every single day, sometimes multiple times. Dianne would stop by the house after work, share a cup of coffee, vent about difficult customers, or celebrate a big job. If she was running late, she'd call. If plans changed, she'd call. It was routine, reliable, the kind of bond that only deepens when it's just the two of you against the world. Rita will tell you, even now, decades later, that Dianne was the kind of daughter every mother hopes for, responsible, loving, present. So when the 15th of October, 1998, rolled around, there was no reason to think it would be any different from 1,000 other days. Dianne woke up that morning in her small apartment on the east side of Fitchburg. She made coffee. She checked her schedule. She had 3 jobs lined up: a residential rekey in the morning, a commercial lock repair around noon, and one last call in the afternoon, a repair job out in the foothills, near Dry Creek Road. The first 2 jobs went off without a hitch. She finished the rekey by 10:30, grabbed lunch at a diner she frequented, and wrapped up the commercial job by 2. Then she called her mother. "I've got one more," she said. "Out near Dry Creek. Shouldn't take long. I'll be home by 5. Rita asked if she needed anything from the store. Dianne said no. They made plans to have dinner together that night, nothing fancy, just leftovers and a rented movie. "Love you, Mom." "Love you too, Mija. Drive safe." That was the last time Rita Vasquez heard her daughter's voice. Dianne loaded her truck, a white Ford Ranger with the DV Locksmithing logo painted on the side, and headed out toward the foothills. She had her tools in the back: lockpicks, tension wrenches, drills, key blanks, everything she might need for a standard repair job. She had her pager clipped to her belt, her wallet in her purse, a thermos of coffee in the cup holder. She was prepared, professional, cautious, like always, but she was driving into something she couldn't prepare for. Before we go further, drop a comment and let me know. Where are you watching from right now? I love hearing from people all over the world who are drawn to these stories. It reminds me why we do this. Because Dianne Vasquez deserves to be remembered, not just as a victim, not just as a cold case that finally got solved, but as a 26-year-old woman who worked hard, loved her mother, and built something meaningful with her own 2 hands. A woman who thought she was just going to fix a lock. A woman who never came home. The 15th of October 1998 started like any other Thursday. The leaves were turning in Fitchburg, deep reds and burnt oranges, painting the hillsides. There was a crispness in the air, that unmistakable feeling of autumn settling in across New England. The kind of day where you'd need a jacket in the morning, but could get away with shirt sleeves by noon. Dianne woke up around 7. She wasn't a morning person by nature, but the locksmith business didn't care about your sleep schedule. People needed help when they needed help, and if you wanted to build a reputation, you showed up. She showered, dressed in her usual work clothes, jeans, a flannel shirt, steel-toed boots, and grabbed her keys. Her apartment was small but tidy. A 1-bedroom place with a kitchenette, a couch she'd bought second-hand, and a bookshelf crammed with mystery novels and repair manuals. Nothing fancy, but it was hers. She poured coffee into a thermos, checked her pager for messages, and headed out to her truck. The white Ford Ranger was parked in the lot behind her building. She'd bought it used 2 years earlier and kept it in good shape, oil changes on schedule, tires rotated, the DV Locksmithing logo freshly painted on both doors. It was more than transportation. It was her mobile office, her livelihood. She tossed her toolbox into the bed of the truck, climbed into the cab, and pulled out onto Main Street. Her first job was in a residential neighborhood on the north side of town. A woman had lost her house keys and needed all the locks rekeyed. Standard work. Dianne arrived on time, introduced herself, and got to it. She worked methodically, explaining each step to the homeowner, making sure everything was secure before she left, finished by 10:30. She grabbed lunch at Rosie's Diner, a spot she hit at least twice a week. The waitress knew her order by heart. Turkey club, no mayo, side of fries, iced tea. Dianne sat at the counter, flipped through the local paper, and left a generous tip before heading out. Her second job was a commercial gig, a law office downtown, needed a malfunctioning deadbolt replaced. She arrived just after noon, swapped out the hardware, tested it half a dozen times to make sure it seated properly, and handed the office manager a receipt. 2 down, 1 to go. She checked her pager. No new messages. She called her answering service from a payphone outside the law office to see if anything had come in. 1 call back. A repair job, out near Dry Creek Road, in the foothills west of Fitchburg. The message had come in late the night before, someone saying they had a jammed lock on an exterior door and needed it fixed as soon as possible. The caller had left a name, a phone number, directions to the property. Dianne jotted it all down, called the number back to confirm the appointment, and got a man on the line. He sounded polite, a little rushed, maybe, but nothing that set off alarm bells. He said he'd be there waiting, told her to come any time after 2. She said she'd head out within the hour. Then she called her mother. "Hey, Mom, just checking in." Rita was at home, folding laundry in front of the TV. She asked how Dianne's day was going. Dianne said fine. Busy, but fine. "I've got one more job," Dianne said. "Out near Dry Creek. Shouldn't take long. I'll be home by 5. Rita asked if she wanted to pick up anything for dinner. Dianne said no. They had plenty of leftovers. They made plans to watch a movie that night, something they'd rented from Blockbuster the weekend before and hadn't gotten around to yet. "Love you, Mom." "Love you too, Mia. Drive safe." Dianne hung up, climbed back into her truck, and headed west. Dry Creek Road wasn't a place most people had reason to visit. It was a narrow, winding stretch of dirt and gravel that snaked through the foothills about 15 miles outside Fitchburg. The area was sparsely populated, mostly old farmhouses, hunting cabins, and stretches of dense forest. Cell phone coverage was spotty at best. If you broke down out there, you were on your own until someone happened to drive by. But Dianne had been to remote locations before. It came with the territory. People who lived off the beaten path still needed locksmiths. She followed the directions she'd been given, turning off the main highway onto a 2-lane road that cut through the trees. The pavement gave way to gravel. The houses grew farther apart. The forest pressed in on both sides, thick with oak and pine. She checked the odometer. Another 3 miles, according to the directions. The road climbed higher into the hills. The afternoon sun slanted through the branches, casting long shadows across the dirt. There was no traffic, no other vehicles. Just the hum of her engine and the crunch of gravel beneath her tires. She passed a rusted mailbox, a collapsed barn, a trailer with boarded-up windows. Then she saw the turnoff. A narrow driveway, barely wide enough for one vehicle, branching off to the right. No mailbox, no house number visible from the road. Just a gap in the trees and a rutted path disappearing into the woods. She slowed down, double-checked the directions. This was it. She turned onto the driveway and followed it in. The trees closed overhead, blocking out most of the light. The truck bounced over ruts and exposed roots. Branches scraped against the sides. After about 100 yards, the driveway opened into a small clearing. There was a house, if you could call it that. More like a cabin. Single-story, wood siding, weathered gray, a sagging porch, windows covered with curtains, a pickup truck parked out front. No other buildings. No neighbors within shouting distance. Dianne put the truck in park and sat there for a moment, taking it in. Something felt off. Not wrong exactly, just quiet, isolated. The kind of place where you'd want to finish the job quickly and get back to civilization before dark. She grabbed her toolbox from the back, slung her keyring over her shoulder, and walked toward the house. The front door opened before she reached it. A man stepped out onto the porch. 40s maybe, average height, work boots, jeans, a flannel jacket. He didn't smile, but he nodded. "You the locksmith?" "That's me," Dianne said. "Dianne Vasquez. You called about a jammed lock." He gestured toward the side of the house. "Yeah, back door. Been sticking for weeks. Can't get it to latch right." "Let's take a look." She followed him around the side of the cabin, her boots crunching on the gravel. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out. The back door was old, solid wood, painted green, with a brass deadbolt that had seen better days. Dianne set her toolbox down, tested the knob, and examined the lock mechanism. "Yeah, I see the problem," she said. "The bolt's misaligned. I can fix this pretty quick." She knelt down, opened her toolbox, and pulled out a screwdriver. That's when everything changed. She didn't hear him move, didn't see it coming. One moment she was focused on the lock, and the next, impact, pain, darkness. By the time the sun set over the Massachusetts foothills that evening, Dianne Vasquez was already gone. Her truck was still parked in the clearing. Her toolbox was still open on the ground. Her pager was still clipped to her belt. But Dianne, 26 years old, skilled, cautious, loved, was gone. And the man who'd called her out to that isolated cabin was already digging. Rita Vasquez started worrying around 6 o'clock. Dianne had said she'd be home by 5. Maybe 5:30 if the job ran long. But 6? That wasn't like her. Dianne was punctual, reliable. If she was going to be late, she called. Rita tried her pager. No response. She waited another 15 minutes, then tried again. Still nothing. By 7, the worry had turned into something heavier, something cold settling in her chest. She called Dianne's apartment. Let it ring 12 times. No answer. She called the answering service Dianne used for her business. The operator said the last message had been picked up around 1 that afternoon. No calls since. Rita paced her living room, staring at the phone, willing it to ring. It didn't. By 9 o'clock, she couldn't take it anymore. She called the Fitchburg Police Department. The dispatcher was polite, but cautious. "Adults go missing for all kinds of reasons," she explained. "Sometimes they lose track of time. Sometimes they decide to stay out late without checking in. Sometimes they just need space." "She wouldn't do that," Rita said, her voice tight. "Not without calling. Something's wrong." The dispatcher took down the information. Dianne's name, her description, the make and model of her truck, the last known location, somewhere near Dry Creek Road. "An officer would be sent out to check the area in the morning," the dispatcher said. Morning. Rita didn't sleep that night. She sat on the couch with the TV on, not watching, just waiting. Every time headlights swept past the window, she jumped up, hoping it was Dianne pulling into the driveway. It never was. When the sun finally came up on October 16, Rita was already dressed and ready to go. She called the police again, demanded they start searching immediately. This time, they listened. 2 patrol officers were dispatched to Dry Creek Road just after 8 that morning. They drove slowly along the winding dirt road, scanning both sides for any sign of Dianne's white Ford Ranger. It didn't take long. About 3 miles in, just past a sharp bend in the road, one of the officers spotted something through the trees. A flash of white, partially hidden in the brush about 20 yards off the road. They pulled over. It was the truck. The Ford Ranger was parked, or more accurately, abandoned, in a small clearing just off the shoulder. The driver's side door was closed but unlocked. The keys were gone. The engine was cold. The officers approached carefully, hands near their sidearms, not sure what they were about to find. The cab was empty. No blood. No signs of a struggle. No broken glass. But Dianne's purse was sitting on the passenger seat. One of the officers opened it. Wallet inside. Driver's license. $43 in cash. Credit cards. A photo of Dianne and her mother tucked into a clear plastic sleeve. Everything was there. Except Dianne. They checked the back of the truck. The toolbox was gone. So were her locksmith tools, the picks, the tension wrenches, the drills, all of it. The bed of the truck was empty except for a tarp and a coil of rope she used for securing equipment. The officers radioed it in. Within an hour, Dry Creek Road was swarming with law enforcement. Fitchburg PD, county sheriff's deputies, state police, K-9 units. A command post was set up at the intersection where the dirt road met the highway. Search teams fanned out into the woods on both sides of the road, calling Dianne's name, looking for any sign of her footprints, clothing, disturbed ground, anything. The dogs picked up a scent near the truck, but lost it about 50 yards into the trees. It was as if she'd just vanished. Investigators processed the truck like a crime scene. They dusted for fingerprints, collected hair and fiber samples, photographed every inch of the interior and exterior. They found Dianne's prints. Of course, it was her truck. But they also found partials that didn't match. Smudged, unclear, not enough to run through any database. They interviewed nearby residents. There weren't many. The closest house was half a mile down the road, an older couple who said they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. No vehicles, no screams, nothing. A few other locals were questioned. A man who lived in a cabin about a mile west, a woman who ran a small farm on the other side of the hill, a hunter who'd been in the area the day before. No one had seen Dianne. No one had seen her truck. No one had heard anything. It was as if she'd driven out to Dry Creek Road and simply ceased to exist. The lead detective on the case, a veteran named Frank Callahan, stood by the truck that afternoon, staring at the empty cab, trying to make sense of it. Her purse was there, her money was there, but her tools were gone. Why take the tools and leave the cash? It didn't fit the profile of a robbery. If someone had attacked her for money, they would have grabbed the purse. If they'd wanted the truck, they would have driven it away. But the tools? What did that mean? Callahan walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for anything the initial search might have missed. Tire tracks, footprints, cigarette butts, anything. He found nothing. The ground was hard-packed, dirt and gravel. No mud, no soft soil to hold impressions. The recent dry spell meant there was no rain to wash away evidence, but it also meant there was no evidence to preserve. By the time the sun started to set on October 16, the search teams had covered a 2-mile radius around the truck. They'd combed through dense forest, checked abandoned structures, waded through creeks. Nothing. Dianne Vasquez had vanished. The truck was towed to the police impound lot for further analysis. The area around Dry Creek Road was cordoned off with crime scene tape. Flyers with Dianne's photo were printed and distributed throughout Fitchburg and the surrounding towns. Rita Vasquez stood in the police station that evening, her face pale, her hands shaking, and asked the question every officer dreaded. "Where is my daughter?" Detective Callahan looked her in the eye and gave her the only answer he had. "We don't know yet, but we're going to find out." It was a promise he meant, but it would take 19 years to keep it, because whoever had taken Dianne Vasquez knew exactly what they were doing. They'd lured her to an isolated location. They'd made sure there were no witnesses. They'd removed her tools to make it look like she might have driven off somewhere else, maybe met with foul play miles away. And then they'd buried her so close to where her truck was found that search teams walked right past her grave a dozen times without knowing. The ground beneath Dry Creek Road held its secrets well, but not forever. The morning after Dianne's truck was found, the Fitchburg Police Department launched a full-scale missing persons investigation. Detective Frank Callahan was assigned as the lead. He was 52 years old, a 28-year veteran of the force, and he'd worked everything from burglaries to homicides. He had a reputation for being thorough, patient, the kind of investigator who didn't jump to conclusions, who followed the evidence wherever it led. But this case was different. There was no evidence. No body, no witnesses, no clear motive. Just an abandoned truck, a missing woman, and a whole lot of questions. Callahan set up a task force. He pulled in 2 other detectives, coordinated with the state police, and reached out to the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program for assistance. If Dianne had been taken across state lines, it became a federal case. If she'd been the victim of a serial offender, the FBI's databases might flag a pattern. But first, they had to figure out what happened. The investigation started with the basics, reconstructing Dianne's last known movements. They knew she'd finished 2 jobs earlier that day, the residential rekey and the commercial deadbolt replacement. Both clients were interviewed. Both confirmed Dianne had been professional, efficient, and showed no signs of distress. The 3rd job, the one near Dry Creek Road, was the problem. Callahan pulled the records from Dianne's answering service. The call had come in at 9:47 p.m. on October 14, the night before she disappeared. A man's voice. He'd left a name, a callback number, and directions to a property off Dry Creek Road. Detectives traced the number. Payphone. It was located outside a gas station on Route 2, about 10 miles south of Fitchburg. The kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee and cigarettes, where you could make a call without anyone paying attention. Investigators pulled surveillance footage from the gas station. The tapes were grainy, low resolution, and the camera didn't have a clear angle on the payphone. They could see people coming and going, but no one stood out, no one they could identify. The name the caller had given? Fake. It didn't match any records. No driver's license, no utility bills, no property ownership. The directions led to a stretch of Dry Creek Road where there were 3 possible properties within a half-mile radius. Detectives visited all of them. The first was an old farmhouse owned by a retired couple in their 70s. They'd lived there for 40 years. They didn't know Dianne, hadn't called a locksmith, hadn't seen anything unusual. The second property was a hunting cabin that had been vacant for months. The owner lived in Connecticut and only used it during deer season. Detectives got a warrant, searched the place top to bottom. No signs of recent activity. No evidence Dianne had ever been there. The third property was a small cabin owned by a man named Leonard Pritchard, 43 years old. Lived alone, worked sporadically as a handyman and carpenter. Had a record nothing violent, just a DUI from 6 years earlier and a couple of unpaid traffic tickets. Detectives knocked on his door on October 18. Pritchard answered. He was calm, cooperative. Said he'd heard about the missing locksmith on the news and thought it was terrible. Had he called for a locksmith recently? No. Had he seen Dianne Vasquez or her truck? No. Had he been home on the afternoon of October 15? He thought so. He'd been working on a project in his shed. Hadn't gone anywhere. Could they take a look around? Pritchard hesitated, then shrugged. Sure, I've got nothing to hide. Callahan and another detective walked the property. The cabin was small, cluttered, but nothing immediately suspicious. Tools scattered around, firewood stacked against the side of the house, a shed out back filled with lumber and carpentry equipment. They checked the shed, checked the truck parked out front, checked the perimeter of the property. Nothing. No signs of a struggle. No blood. No freshly disturbed soil. No indication Dianne had ever been there. Pritchard's truck was a different make and model than any tire tracks found near Dianne's abandoned vehicle. His boots didn't match any prints, not that there were many clear prints to begin with. They asked if he'd be willing to come down to the station for a formal interview. He said sure, no problem. At the station, Pritchard sat across from Callahan in a small interrogation room. The detective asked him to walk through his day on October 15. Pritchard did. He'd woken up late, around 9. Made breakfast. Spent most of the day working in his shed, cutting wood for a bookshelf he was building. He'd gone into town around 4 to grab supplies from the hardware store. Got back around 5:30. Made dinner. Watched TV. Callahan asked if anyone could verify that. Pritchard shook his head. He lived alone. Didn't have many friends. Kept to himself. Did he know Dianne Vasquez? No. Had he ever used a locksmith? Not recently. Callahan pressed. Asked the same questions in different ways, looking for inconsistencies. Pritchard's story didn't change. After 2 hours, they let him go. They didn't have enough to hold him. No physical evidence, no witnesses, no probable cause. But Callahan's gut told him something was off. He ran a deeper background check on Pritchard, pulled his financial records, his phone records, his employment history. Pritchard had bounced around a lot, odd jobs, short-term gigs. He'd been fired from a construction company 3 years earlier for showing up late and getting into an argument with a supervisor. He'd had a restraining order filed against him in 1995 by an ex-girlfriend who claimed he'd shown up at her apartment uninvited and refused to leave. The order had expired after a year, and there'd been no further incidents. It wasn't much, but it was something. Callahan kept Pritchard on the list of persons of interest. Meanwhile, the search for Dianne continued. Volunteers from the community joined law enforcement in combing the woods around Dry Creek Road. Hundreds of people turned out friends, neighbors, business owners, people who'd never met Dianne but wanted to help. They searched for days, then weeks. 9 units were brought in multiple times. Cadaver dogs, tracking dogs. They covered miles of forest, following every possible trail. Nothing. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew over the area, scanning for heat signatures. Nothing. Divers searched nearby ponds and creeks. Nothing. The local media picked up the story. Dianne's face was on the front page of the Fitchburg Sentinel. TV stations ran segments during the evening news. Tips started pouring in. Someone claimed they'd seen a woman matching Dianne's description at a rest stop in New Hampshire. Detectives followed up. It wasn't her. Someone else said they'd seen her truck heading south on I-91 the night she disappeared. Detectives checked traffic cameras. No match. A psychic called and said she'd had a vision of Dianne near water, surrounded by trees. Callahan was skeptical, but they searched the area she described anyway. Nothing. Every lead turned into a dead end. By mid-November, 6 weeks after Dianne vanished, the investigation had stalled. The task force was still active, but resources were being pulled in other directions. Other cases demanded attention. The trail was going cold. Callahan refused to give up. He kept working the case in his spare time, reviewing files, re-interviewing witnesses, looking for anything he might have missed. But the truth was, without a body, without a witness, without physical evidence, there was only so much he could do. Dianne Vasquez had been swallowed by the Massachusetts wilderness, and whoever was responsible had covered their tracks well, too well. Cases like this remind us how quickly someone's entire world can shift. One phone call, one decision to take a job in an isolated location, and everything changes. If you're still with me, smash that like button. It helps more people discover stories that deserve to be told. Because Dianne's story doesn't end here, not by a long shot. By December 1998, the case was still open, but the active search had ended. Dianne Vasquez was officially listed as a missing person. Her file sat on Callahan's desk, a constant reminder of the one case he couldn't solve. Rita Vasquez called the police station every week, sometimes twice a week, asking for updates, begging them not to give up. Callahan promised her he wouldn't, but as the months turned into years, even he had to admit the odds of finding Dianne alive were shrinking. The question wasn't if something terrible had happened to her, it was whether they'd ever find out what. Rita Vasquez refused to believe her daughter was gone, not in the way the police meant when they used words like presumed deceased or likely a homicide. Not in the way neighbors whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. Not in the way the local newspaper had started referring to Dianne in the past tense. Rita knew deep in her bones, in that place where a mother's intuition lives, that until she had proof, until someone showed her a body, until she had something concrete to bury, Dianne was still out there somewhere. And she was going to bring her home. The first thing Rita did was install a new light fixture on the front porch. It was a simple thing. A brass fixture with a frosted glass globe. She screwed in a 100-watt bulb, flipped the switch, and made herself a promise. That light would stay on until Dianne came home, every single night, no exceptions. Neighbors noticed. At first, they thought maybe Rita had just forgotten to turn it off. Then days passed, weeks, months. The light stayed on. Some people thought it was a waste of electricity. Others thought it was sad. A few understood it for what it was. A beacon, a signal, a refusal to surrender to the darkness. Rita didn't care what anyone thought. That light was for Dianne. In the months after her daughter disappeared, Rita threw herself into the search with a ferocity that surprised even her. She wasn't a confrontational person by nature. She'd spent most of her life working quietly, keeping her head down, taking care of her family. But grief has a way of reshaping you, of turning sorrow into fuel. She organized search parties every weekend. She printed thousands of flyers and posted them everywhere: grocery stores, gas stations, libraries, community centers. She drove to neighboring towns and handed them out at busy intersections. Missing. Dianne Vasquez. Last seen the 15th of October, 1998. The flyer had Dianne's photo, a snapshot from the previous summer, her daughter smiling, hair pulled back, eyes bright. Below the photo, a description, a timeline, a phone number to call with tips. Rita kept boxes of those flyers in her living room. Every time she left the house, she took a stack with her. She called the police station twice a week, sometimes more. Detective Callahan was patient with her, but she could hear the frustration in his voice. He didn't have answers. The case wasn't moving forward. That wasn't good enough for Rita. She hired a private investigator in early 1999, a former state trooper named Bill Hackett, who'd retired and started his own firm. He was expensive, more than Rita could really afford, but she didn't care. She pulled money from her savings. She picked up extra shifts at the mill. She sold her car and bought a cheaper one. Hackett worked the case for 6 months. He re-interviewed witnesses. He followed up on tips the police hadn't prioritized. He drove out to Dry Creek Road a dozen times, walking the area, looking for anything that might have been missed. He found nothing new. In August 1999, he sat down with Rita in her kitchen and told her the truth. Without new evidence, there was nowhere else to go. He was sorry. He wished he had better news. Rita thanked him, paid him what she owed, and kept searching on her own. She attended vigils. She spoke at community events. She did interviews with local TV stations whenever they'd have her. She wanted Dianne's face out there. She wanted people to remember. Because the worst thing, worse than not knowing, worse than the sleepless nights and the constant ache in her chest, was the idea that people would forget. That Dianne would become just another name in a file, just another cold case that no one talked about anymore. Rita wouldn't let that happen. On the first anniversary of Dianne's disappearance, the 15th of October, 1999, Rita organized a candlelight vigil in downtown Fitchburg. More than 200 people showed up. They stood in the town square, holding candles, listening as Rita spoke about her daughter, about the kind of person she was, about the hole her absence had left. "She's still out there," Rita said, her voice breaking. "And I'm not giving up. I will never give up." The crowd applauded. Some people cried. A few came up afterward and hugged her, promised they'd keep looking, keep hoping. But as the years went on, fewer people showed up to the vigils. Life moved on. People had their own problems, their own tragedies. Dianne's story faded from the front page. The TV stations stopped calling. By 2005, the vigils were smaller. A few dozen people, mostly Rita's close friends, and a handful of community members who'd known Dianne. By 2010, it was just Rita and a couple of neighbors standing in the square, lighting candles in the October wind. But Rita never missed a year. Every October 15, she was there. She also kept calling the police, even after Detective Callahan retired in 2003. Even after new detectives took over the case and admitted they didn't have any active leads. Even after the case was officially classified as cold, Rita called. She wanted them to know she hadn't forgotten. She wanted them to know someone was still paying attention. Take a second and comment. What time is it where you are right now? Let's build this community together. Because stories like this, stories about people who refuse to give up, matter. And they need to be heard. Rita's friends worried about her. They saw the toll it was taking, the weight loss, the sleepless nights, the way she'd sometimes zone out in the middle of a conversation, her mind somewhere else. They gently suggested she see a therapist, maybe join a support group for families of missing persons. She tried. She went to a few meetings, sat in a circle with other parents, other spouses, other siblings who were living in the same terrible limbo. It helped, a little, knowing she wasn't alone, but it didn't bring Dianne home. Nothing did. The years blurred together. 2006, 2008, 2012, 2015. Rita kept working, kept living, kept the porch light on. She celebrated birthdays alone, Thanksgivings alone, Christmases alone. She kept Dianne's room exactly the way it had been. The bed made, the closet full of clothes, the mystery novels stacked on the nightstand. Sometimes she'd sit in there, on the edge of the bed, and just talk to her daughter, tell her about her day, about what was happening in the world, about how much she missed her. People told her it wasn't healthy, that she needed to move on, that holding on to hope for this long was only hurting her. But Rita didn't care. Hope was all she had, and she wasn't letting go. By 2017, 19 years after Dianne disappeared, Rita was 68 years old. Her hair had gone grey, her hands shook a little more than they used to. She'd retired from the mill. She spent most of her time at home, alone, waiting. The porch light still burned every night. She still called the police every few months, even though she knew they didn't have anything new to tell her. She still believed, against all logic, against all odds, that one day she'd get answers. She just didn't know those answers were about to claw their way out of the ground. Less than a mile from where her daughter's truck had been found 19 years earlier, buried beneath the same road Dianne had driven down on that October afternoon. Waiting. Section 7. Years pass. Cold case status. Target word count. 1,100 words. By the time the calendar flipped to the year 2000, Dianne Vasquez's case had already started to fade from public consciousness. The initial media frenzy had died down. The search parties had stopped. The tip line that once rang constantly had gone quiet. Dianne's missing person flyer, once plastered on every storefront in Fitchburg, had been covered over by newer posters. Lost dogs, yard sales, community events. Life moved on, but the case file didn't close. It sat in a grey metal cabinet in the Fitchburg Police Department's records room, along with dozens of other unsolved cases. Burglaries that had gone cold. Assaults where the suspect was never identified. Disappearances that had no resolution. Detective Frank Callahan kept a copy of the file on his desk until the day he retired in 2003. Even after 5 years of dead ends, he couldn't let it go. He'd review it every few months, looking for something he might have missed, a detail overlooked, a connection not made. He never found it. When Callahan retired, the case was reassigned to a younger detective named Marcus Webb. Webb inherited a stack of cold cases, and Dianne's was near the top. He read through the file, familiarized himself with the timeline, made a few follow-up calls. But there was nowhere to go. No new leads, no new witnesses, no new evidence. The case stayed cold. Over the years, different detectives cycled through. Some gave it more attention than others. Some made genuine efforts to generate new leads, re-interviewing old witnesses, checking for similar cases in neighboring jurisdictions, running names through updated databases. Nothing ever came of it. The problem was simple. Without a body, without physical evidence, without a witness, there was no case to prosecute. Even if they had a suspect and Leonard Pritchard's name still appeared in the file as a person of interest, they couldn't charge him with anything. Suspicion wasn't evidence. A gut feeling wasn't proof, and Pritchard had never slipped up, never confessed, never gave them a reason to dig deeper. He still lived in the same cabin off Dry Creek Road, still kept to himself, still worked odd jobs around the area. Detectives would occasionally drive by, just to check, see if anything had changed, if he'd done something to draw attention. He never did. As far as anyone could tell, Leonard Pritchard was just a quiet, unremarkable man, living a quiet, unremarkable life in the Massachusetts foothills. But the investigators who'd worked the case, Callahan, Webb, and the others who came after, never fully crossed him off the list. There was something about him, something that didn't sit right, but suspicion wasn't enough. By 2005, advancements in forensic technology had revolutionized criminal investigations across the country. DNA databases were expanding. Cold cases from the 70s and 80s were being solved because of genetic evidence that had been sitting in evidence rooms for decades. Detectives in Fitchburg hoped the same might be true for Dianne's case. They re-examined the evidence collected from her truck, the fingerprints, the hair and fiber samples. They submitted everything to the state crime lab for updated analysis. The results came back inconclusive. The partial prints lifted from the truck were too degraded to run through AFIS, the automated fingerprint identification system. The hair samples didn't have roots, which meant no DNA. The fibers were generic denim, cotton, nothing that could be traced to a specific source. It was frustrating, maddening even. The tools existed to solve cases like this, but they needed something to work with, and they had nothing. In 2008, the case was featured on a regional true crime TV show. The producers did a segment on unsolved disappearances in New England, and Dianne's story was one of 3 cases highlighted. They interviewed Rita, showed photos of Dianne, recreated the timeline, asked viewers to call in with tips. The tip line lit up for a few days. People called saying they'd seen someone who looked like Dianne in Vermont, in Maine, in upstate New York. Detectives followed up on every single one. None of them panned out. By 2010, 12 years after Dianne disappeared, the case was essentially dormant. It was still technically open. Missing persons cases don't close unless there's a resolution, but no one was actively working it. Rita still called, still asked for updates. The answer was always the same: we haven't forgotten. If anything new comes in, we'll follow up. But nothing new ever came in. The detectives who worked cold cases would occasionally pull Dianne's file, review it, see if fresh eyes might catch something. But the problem wasn't a lack of effort, it was a lack of evidence. Dianne Vasquez had vanished into thin air. And whoever was responsible had done an almost perfect job of covering their tracks. Almost. Because the thing about secrets buried in the ground is that the ground doesn't stay still forever. Roads get widened, foundations get dug, pipelines get laid. And sometimes, after years of silence, the earth gives up what it's been hiding. In 2017, 19 years after Dianne Vasquez drove into the Massachusetts foothills and never came home, a routine road maintenance project was scheduled for Dry Creek Road. The county had allocated funds to widen and repave a 3-mile stretch of the old dirt road. It was part of a broader infrastructure improvement plan. Nothing unusual, just standard work. A crew was hired, equipment was brought in, a timeline was set. The project was supposed to take 6 weeks. It took 2 days before everything changed, because on the morning of the 3rd of October 2017, a road crew foreman's shovel hit something buried beneath the clay, something that had been waiting in the dark for 19 years. Something that was about to rewrite everything investigators thought they knew about Dianne Vasquez's disappearance, and something that was about to put Leonard Pritchard's name back at the top of the suspect list had already started to fade from public consciousness. The initial media frenzy had died down, the search parties had stopped, the tip line that once rang constantly had gone quiet. Dianne's missing person flyer, once plastered on every storefront in Fitchburg, had been covered over by newer posters: lost dogs, yard sales, community events. Life moved on, but the case file didn't close. It sat in a gray metal cabinet in the Fitchburg Police Department's records room, along with dozens of other unsolved cases: burglaries that had gone cold, assaults where the suspect was never identified, disappearances that had no resolution. Detective Frank Callahan kept a copy of the file on his desk until the day he retired in 2003. Even after 5 years of dead ends, he couldn't let it go. He'd review it every few months, looking for something he might have missed, a detail overlooked, a connection not made. He never found it. When Callahan retired, the case was reassigned to a younger detective named Marcus Webb. Webb inherited a stack of cold cases, and Dianne's was near the top. He read through the file, familiarized himself with the timeline, made a few follow-up calls. But there was nowhere to go. No new leads, no new witnesses, no new evidence. The case stayed cold. Over the years, different detectives cycled through. Some gave it more attention than others. Some made genuine efforts to generate new leads, re-interviewing old witnesses, checking for similar cases in neighboring jurisdictions, running names through updated databases. Nothing ever came of it. The problem was simple. Without a body, without physical evidence, without a witness, there was no case to prosecute. Even if they had a suspect, and Leonard Pritchard's name still appeared in the file as a person of interest, they couldn't charge him with anything. Suspicion wasn't evidence, a gut feeling wasn't proof, and Pritchard had never slipped up, never confessed, never gave them a reason to dig deeper. He still lived in the same cabin off Dry Creek Road, still kept to himself, still worked odd jobs around the area. Detectives would occasionally drive by, just to check, see if anything had changed, if he'd done something to draw attention. He never did. As far as anyone could tell, Leonard Pritchard was just a quiet, unremarkable man living a quiet, unremarkable life in the Massachusetts foothills. But the investigators who'd worked the case, Callahan, Webb, and the others who came after, never fully crossed him off the list. There was something about him, something that didn't sit right, but suspicion wasn't enough. By 2005, advancements in forensic technology had revolutionized criminal investigations across the country. DNA databases were expanding. Cold cases from the 70s and 80s were being solved because of genetic evidence that had been sitting in evidence rooms for decades. Detectives in Fitchburg hoped the same might be true for Dianne's case. They re-examined the evidence collected from her truck, the fingerprints, the hair and fiber samples. They submitted everything to the state crime lab for updated analysis. The results came back inconclusive. The partial prints lifted from the truck were too degraded to run through AFIS, the automated fingerprint identification system. The hair samples didn't have roots, which meant no DNA. The fibers were generic denim, cotton, nothing that could be traced to a specific source. It was frustrating, maddening even. The tools existed to solve cases like this, but they needed something to work with, and they had nothing. In 2008, the case was featured on a regional true crime TV show. The producers did a segment on unsolved disappearances in New England, and Dianne's story was one of 3 cases highlighted. They interviewed Rita, showed photos of Dianne, recreated the timeline, asked viewers to call in with tips. The tip line lit up for a few days. People called saying they'd seen someone who looked like Dianne in Vermont, in Maine, in upstate New York. Detectives followed up on every single one. None of them panned out. By 2010, 12 years after Dianne disappeared, the case was essentially dormant. It was still technically open. Missing persons cases don't close unless there's a resolution, but no one was actively working it. Rita still called, still asked for updates. The answer was always the same. We haven't forgotten. If anything new comes in, we'll follow up. But nothing new ever came in. The detectives who worked cold cases would occasionally pull Dianne's file, review it, see if fresh eyes might catch something. But the problem wasn't a lack of effort. It was a lack of evidence. Dianne Vasquez had vanished into thin air, and whoever was responsible had done an almost perfect job of covering their tracks. Almost, because the thing about secrets buried in the ground is that the ground doesn't stay still forever. Roads get widened, foundations get dug, pipelines get laid, and sometimes, after years of silence, the earth gives up what it's been hiding. In 2017, 19 years after Dianne Vasquez drove into the Massachusetts foothills and never came home, a routine road maintenance project was scheduled for Dry Creek Road. The county had allocated funds to widen and repave a 3-mile stretch of the old dirt road. It was part of a broader infrastructure improvement plan. Nothing unusual, just standard work. A crew was hired, equipment was brought in, a timeline was set. The project was supposed to take 6 weeks. It took 2 days before everything changed, because on the morning of the 3rd of October 2017, a road crew foreman's shovel hit something buried beneath the clay, something that had been waiting in the dark for 19 years, something that was about to rewrite everything investigators thought they knew about Dianne Vasquez's disappearance, and something that was about to put Leonard Pritchard's name back at the top of the suspect list. The 3rd of October 2017 started like any other Tuesday for the road crew working Dry Creek Road. The sun was barely up when the trucks rolled in dump trucks, backhoes, graders, all the heavy equipment needed to widen and repave a 3-mile stretch of forgotten backwoods road. The crew had been at it since Monday morning, clearing brush, grading the shoulders, preparing the roadbed for new asphalt. It was hard work, dirty work, the kind of job where you showed up at dawn, put your head down, and pushed through until the sun went down. The foreman's name was Tommy Briggs, 51 years old. He'd been in construction for 30 years, worked every kind of site you could imagine: roads, bridges, commercial buildings, residential developments. He'd seen it all, or so he thought. The crew was working about 2.5 miles in from the main highway, right where Dry Creek Road curved sharply to the west. The plan was to widen the shoulder on the north side by about 8 feet, which meant excavating into the hillside and hauling away the excess dirt. Tommy was operating the backhoe that morning. He'd already made a dozen passes, scooping up clay and rock and dumping it into the bed of a waiting truck. The work was repetitive, mechanical. His mind was on autopilot. Scoop, lift, dump, repeat. He angled the bucket into the hillside for another pass. The teeth bit into the earth, and then resistance. Not rock, not a root, something else. Tommy eased off the hydraulics and backed the bucket out. He climbed down from the cab, grabbed a shovel from the truck, and walked over to see what he'd hit. Probably a boulder, he figured, or an old piece of rebar left over from some long-forgotten project. He knelt down and started scraping away the loose dirt. That's when he saw it. Fabric. Faded. Deteriorated. But unmistakably fabric. His stomach dropped. He stopped digging, stood up, looked around at the rest of the crew. "Hey, shut it down!" The other workers killed their engines. The site went quiet, except for the wind moving through the trees. "What's up, Tommy?" one of the guys called over. Tommy didn't answer right away. He knelt back down, brushed away more dirt with his gloved hand, more fabric. And something else. Wires. Thin, corroded wires tangled in the soil. And then metal. A small, tarnished object catching the morning light. Tommy pulled it free, wiped the dirt off with his thumb. It was a keyring. Brass. Engraved. DV Locksmithing. Tommy's hand started shaking. He'd lived in the area his whole life. He remembered the case. Everyone did. The locksmith who disappeared back in the 90s. The massive search. The vigils. The mother who never gave up. He stood up. The keyring clutched in his fist and pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to dial 911. "Yeah, this is Tommy Briggs. I'm with the county road crew out on Dry Creek Road, about 2.5 miles west of Route 2. I think we found human remains." The dispatcher asked him to repeat that. He did. She told him to secure the site. Don't touch anything else. Don't let anyone near it. Police and forensics were on the way. Tommy hung up and turned to his crew. "Pack it up. We're done for the day." "What? Why?" Tommy held up the keyring. "Because we just found Dianne Vasquez." Within 30 minutes, Dry Creek Road was swarming with law enforcement. Fitchburg PD, County Sheriff, State Police, the Medical Examiner's Office. Crime scene investigators in white Tyvek suits, carrying equipment cases and cameras. Yellow tape went up, cordoning off a 100-yard perimeter around the excavation site. The road was closed. No one in or out except authorized personnel. Detective Marcus Webb, now a lieutenant, after 14 years on the force, was one of the first to arrive. He'd been in a budget meeting when the call came through. He didn't wait for it to end, just stood up, grabbed his jacket, and walked out. He'd inherited Dianne Vasquez's case back in 2003. He'd read the file 100 times. He'd driven out to Dry Creek Road more times than he could count, walking the area, trying to imagine what had happened. And now, after 19 years, the answer was literally being unearthed in front of him. He stood at the edge of the excavation site, watching as the forensic team carefully, painstakingly, removed layers of soil. They worked slowly, methodically. Every scoop of dirt was sifted. Every item was photographed in place before being collected. The fabric Tommy had found turned out to be clothing. A flannel shirt, denim jeans, work boots. The wires were electrical components, pieces of tools, a voltage tester, wire strippers, and then they found the bones. The medical examiner, Dr. Lori Tan, supervised the exhumation personally. She'd been with the state ME's office for 12 years and had worked dozens of cases involving skeletal remains. But this one was different. This one had a name, a face, a mother who'd been waiting 19 years for answers. The remains were in a shallow grave, buried about 4 feet below the surface. The body had been placed in a fetal position, wrapped in a tarp that had mostly disintegrated. The soil in this part of Massachusetts was dense clay, which had helped preserve some of the remains, but 19 years in the ground had taken its toll. Dr. Tan worked for hours, carefully extracting bones, cataloging everything, taking samples for analysis. By late afternoon, the exhumation was complete. The remains were loaded into the medical examiner's van and transported to the state lab in Boston. Detective Webb stayed at the site until the sun went down, watching as the forensic team continued to process the scene. They found more tools buried nearby: lockpicks, tension wrenches, a cordless drill, all of it consistent with the equipment Dianne would have had with her. They also found something else, a piece of rope, nylon, frayed at both ends. It had been buried with the body. Webb bagged it personally, labeled it, handed it to the evidence tech. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew what it meant. Dianne hadn't just been killed, she'd been restrained. That night, Webb sat in his office at the station, staring at the case file that had been gathering dust for over a decade. He pulled out the list of persons of interest. Leonard Pritchard's name was still there. Webb picked up the phone and called the district attorney's office. "We need to reopen the Vasquez case," he said. "And we need a warrant." The next morning, dental records confirmed what everyone already knew. The remains found on Dry Creek Road belonged to Dianne Vasquez. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the skull. The medical examiner found fractures consistent with being struck multiple times with a heavy object. There were also signs of ligature marks on the bones of her wrists, indicating she'd been bound before she was killed. Time of death: consistent with October 1998. Manner of death: homicide. After 19 years, Dianne Vasquez's disappearance was officially a murder investigation, and the clock was ticking. Because whoever had killed her and buried her less than 200 yards from where her truck had been found had been walking free for nearly 2 decades, but not for much longer. Detective Webb pulled up the old file on Leonard Pritchard, reviewed every note, every interview, every piece of circumstantial evidence that had never been enough to build a case. Back in 1998, they hadn't had a body, hadn't had a crime scene, hadn't had physical evidence. Now they did. Webb started making calls. He contacted the state crime lab, requested expedited DNA analysis on the rope, the clothing, anything that might yield genetic material. He pulled property records for the area around Dry Creek Road, cross-referenced them with the location of the grave. The burial site was on public land, a narrow strip between the road and a private property line. That private property belonged to Leonard Pritchard. His cabin was less than 300 yards from where Dianne's body had been found. Webb felt the pieces starting to click into place. He requested surveillance on Pritchard, assigned 2 officers to watch his cabin, track his movements, see if he did anything that suggested he knew the investigation was heating up. Then Webb drove out to Dry Creek Road himself. He stood at the edge of the excavation site, now empty, except for the disturbed earth and the lingering smell of clay. He looked west, toward the trees, toward Pritchard's cabin, and he made a promise. The same promise Frank Callahan had made to Rita Vasquez 19 years earlier. We're going to find out what happened, and we're going to make sure justice is served. This time, he had the evidence to back it up. The state medical examiner's office in Boston received Dianne Vasquez's remains on the evening of the 3rd of October 2017. Dr. Lori Tan had overseen the exhumation personally, and now she was responsible for the forensic analysis. She'd worked hundreds of cases involving skeletal remains, victims of accidents, suicides, homicides, bodies found in rivers, in forests, in abandoned buildings. But this case carried a weight that was hard to ignore. 19 years, a mother who'd never stopped searching, a community that had never forgotten. Dr. Tan knew the world was watching. She started with the basics, a full skeletal examination. The remains were incomplete. 19 years in the ground had taken a toll. Some of the smaller bones were missing or too degraded to analyze, but the major bones were intact enough to tell a story. The skull showed clear signs of trauma. 3 distinct fracture lines across the left parietal bone, consistent with being struck multiple times with a blunt object. The fractures had a specific pattern linea, depressed, which suggested the weapon had been something heavy and relatively flat. A shovel, maybe, or a piece of lumber. Dr. Tan measured the fractures, photographed them from multiple angles, and took samples for microscopic analysis. The hyoid bone, a small, horseshoe-shaped bone in the neck, was fractured as well. That was significant. Hyoid fractures are often associated with strangulation, though they can also occur from blunt force trauma to the throat. Dr. Tan made a note. Possible manual strangulation or compression of the neck. She moved on to the wrists. The radius and ulna, the bones of the forearm, showed perimortem marks, grooves, shallow indentations that had been made around the time of death. The pattern was consistent with ligature marks. Dianne had been bound tightly. Dr. Tan cross-referenced the marks with the piece of nylon rope that had been recovered from the grave. The width matched. She took samples of the rope for DNA analysis and sent them to the state crime lab. Next, she examined the clothing. The flannel shirt and jeans had deteriorated significantly, but there were still intact sections. She cut samples from areas that showed potential staining dark discolorations that could be blood. Presumptive tests came back positive for blood. Human blood. The samples were sent to the lab for DNA extraction and comparison. Dr. Tan also examined the boots. Steel-toed work boots, size 7. The soles were caked with dried mud and clay. She scraped samples and sent them for soil analysis. If they could match the soil composition to a specific location, It might help establish where Dianne had been killed before being buried. By the end of the first day, Dr. Tan had a preliminary profile. Victim: female, mid-20s, consistent with Dianne Vasquez's age and physical description. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head, with possible contributing factors of strangulation or asphyxiation. Manner of death: homicide. Time: since death: approximately 19 years, consistent with October 1998. But preliminary wasn't enough. They needed confirmation. The next step was dental comparison. Dr. Tan contacted Dianne's dentist, Dr. Raymond Keller, who'd retired in 2005 but still had records stored in his old office. The records were retrieved and sent to the ME's office. Dr. Tan compared the dental x-rays from 1997 with the teeth recovered from the remains. It was a perfect match. Upper right, second molar, filled in 1995. Lower left, first premolar, slight rotation, consistent with records. Upper left canine, small chip on the incisal edge, noted in the 1997 exam. Every detail lined up. On the 5th of October 2017, 2 days after the remains were discovered, Dr. Tan signed the official report. Positive identification: Dianne Marie Vasquez. Detective Webb was notified immediately. He sat in his office, staring at the report, feeling the weight of 19 years pressing down on him. They had a body. They had a cause of death. They had a crime scene. Now, they needed a suspect. But before he could move forward, there was something he had to do. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he'd called dozens of times over the years. Rita Vasquez answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Vasquez, this is Lieutenant Marcus Webb with the Fitchburg Police Department." There was a pause. Then quietly, "You found her?" "Yes, ma'am, we did." Rita didn't say anything for a long moment. Webb could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, slow, steady, like she was trying to hold herself together. "Where?" she finally asked. "Dry Creek Road. About 200 yards from where we found her truck." Another pause. "She was there the whole time?" "Yes, ma'am." Rita's voice cracked. 19 years. She was right there, and we walked past her. Webb closed his eyes. "I'm so sorry. Do you know who did it? We're working on that. We have evidence. We're going to find out. Promise me." "I promise." Rita hung up without saying goodbye. Webb sat there for a moment, the phone still in his hand, and then he got back to work. The forensic analysis continued over the next several days. The DNA lab processed the samples from the rope, the clothing, and the remains. They extracted a partial DNA profile from the rope, not Dianne's. Someone else had handled it. Someone who'd tied her wrists. Someone who'd buried her. The profile was entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and crime scenes. No match. That meant whoever had killed Dianne either didn't have a criminal record that required DNA submission, or they'd never been caught for anything serious enough to be entered into the system. But the profile was saved. If they identified a suspect, they could compare it. The soil samples from Dianne's boots were analyzed next. The composition was consistent with the clay and mineral content found in the area around Dry Creek Road. But more specifically, it matched soil samples taken from a particular stretch of private property, Leonard Pritchard's property. Webb felt the case tightening. The forensic team also analyzed the tools that had been buried with Dianne, her locksmith kit, the picks, the wrenches, the drill. They were covered in soil and corrosion, but they were intact. Why bury the tools with the body? Webb thought about it. If someone had killed Dianne and wanted to make it look like she'd run off or been abducted somewhere else, they'd take the tools, make it seem like she'd driven away with them. But if they buried the tools with her, it meant they wanted everything gone. No evidence left behind. No trace. It was a calculated move, methodical. Whoever had done this had thought it through. But they'd made one mistake. They'd buried her too close to the road. And 19 years later, a road crew had found her. By the 10th of October 2017, the forensic analysis was complete. Dr. Tan submitted her final report to the district attorney's office. Victim: Dianne Marie Vasquez, age 26. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head, with evidence of ligature restraint and possible asphyxiation. Manner of death: homicide. Evidence recovered: nylon rope with foreign DNA, clothing with bloodstains, tools consistent with victim's profession, soil samples matching specific geographic location. The DA reviewed the report and called a meeting with Detective Webb and the lead prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Karen Delgado. "Do we have enough for an arrest?" the DA asked. Webb laid out the case, the timeline, the location of the body, the proximity to Pritchard's property, the soil match, the DNA on the rope. "We don't have a direct match to Pritchard yet," Webb admitted. "But we have enough for a warrant. We search his property, collect DNA, see if it matches the profile from the rope." Delgado nodded. "Let's do it." The warrant was drafted that afternoon. And the next morning, Detective Webb and a tactical team headed out to Dry Creek Road, to the cabin where Leonard Pritchard had been living quietly for the past 19 years, thinking he'd gotten away with it. Leonard Pritchard had been living in the same cabin off Dry Creek Road for 23 years. He'd bought the property in 1994 for next to nothing, a rundown structure on 2 acres of wooded land that nobody else wanted. No neighbors, no through traffic. Just trees, silence, and the kind of isolation that suited him fine. He was 43 years old when Dianne Vasquez disappeared. Now, in 2017, he was 62. His hair had gone gray. His face was lined and weathered. He still worked odd jobs, carpentry, handyman work, whatever paid cash under the table. He kept to himself. Always had. People in town knew him, but nobody really knew him. He wasn't friendly, but he wasn't hostile either. Just quiet, unremarkable. The kind of guy you'd pass on the street and forget 5 minutes later, which was exactly how he liked it. For 19 years, Leonard Pritchard had gone about his life as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't lured a young woman to his property, killed her, and buried her body less than 300 yards from his front door. He'd watched the search parties comb the woods. He'd seen the helicopters fly overhead. He'd driven past the missing person flyers taped to every storefront in Fitchburg, and he'd never said a word, because he thought he'd been careful, thought he'd covered his tracks, thought the ground would keep his secret forever. He was wrong. Detective Marcus Webb had been building a case against Leonard Pritchard since the moment Dianne's remains were identified. He'd gone back through the original investigation files from 1998. Read every interview, every report, every note that Detective Frank Callahan had made. Pritchard's name had come up early. He lived close to where Dianne's truck had been found. He'd been questioned. His property had been searched, though not thoroughly, because back then they didn't have probable cause for a full forensic sweep. Pritchard had denied knowing Dianne, denied calling a locksmith, denied seeing anything unusual on the 15th of October 1998. His story had been consistent. His alibi had been weak, but not disprovable, and without physical evidence, there'd been nothing to charge him with. But now, 19 years later, the situation had changed. They had a body, they had a crime scene, they had forensic evidence, and they had a suspect who'd been living 300 yards from that crime scene for 2 decades. Webb started digging deeper into Pritchard's background. He pulled every record he could find: employment history, financial records, criminal history, medical records, anything that might give him insight into who Leonard Pritchard really was. What he found painted a disturbing picture. Pritchard had been born in Fitchburg in 1955. His father had been a machinist at a local factory. His mother had died when Leonard was 12, cancer. His father had remarried a year later, and by all accounts, Leonard hadn't gotten along with his stepmother. He'd dropped out of high school in his junior year, worked a series of low-wage jobs, got into trouble a few times: petty theft, disorderly conduct, nothing that resulted in serious jail time. In 1987, he'd been arrested for assault, a bar fight that had gotten out of hand. He'd broken another man's jaw, pled down to a misdemeanor, served 6 months, got out on probation. In 1995, an ex-girlfriend named Monica Ruiz had filed a restraining order against him. She claimed he'd shown up at her apartment multiple times after she'd broken up with him, that he'd refused to leave, that he'd made threats. The restraining order had been granted. It expired a year later. Monica had moved out of state shortly after. Webb tracked her down. She was living in Arizona now, married with 2 kids. He called her, "Miss Ruiz, my name is Lieutenant Marcus Webb with the Fitchburg Police Department. I'm calling about Leonard Pritchard." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "What did he do?" she finally asked. "I can't get into specifics, but we're investigating a serious crime. I need to ask you some questions about your relationship with him." Monica hesitated. Then, "Okay." Webb asked her to describe what had happened back in 1995. She told him they'd dated for about 6 months. At first, Leonard had seemed fine. Quiet, but fine. But over time, he'd become possessive, controlling. He didn't like her going out with friends. Didn't like her talking to other men. Got jealous over nothing. She'd broken up with him in March 1995. He didn't take it well. He started showing up at her apartment unannounced, calling her at all hours, following her to work. "I told him to leave me alone," Monica said. "But he wouldn't. He'd just stand outside my building, staring up at my window. It was terrifying." She'd filed the restraining order after he'd cornered her in a parking lot one night and grabbed her by the arm, telling her she was making a mistake, that they belonged together. "Did he ever threaten you?" Webb asked. "Not directly, but the way he looked at me. I knew he was capable of something. I just didn't know what." After the restraining order was issued, Leonard had backed off. But Monica didn't feel safe. She'd moved to Arizona 3 months later and never looked back. "Has he contacted you since?" "No, and I hope he never does." Webb thanked her and hung up. He added the information to his file. Possessive, controlling. History of not taking rejection well. It fit. Webb kept digging. He pulled phone records from 1998 landline records, since cell phones weren't as common back then. He cross-referenced calls made from payphones in the area around the time Dianne received the repair request. One call stood out. A call made from the payphone outside the gas station on Route 2 on the 14th of October 1998 at 9:47 p.m. The exact time Dianne's answering service had logged the repair request. The call had lasted 2 minutes. Webb checked the location of the payphone. It was 8 miles from Pritchard's cabin. An easy drive. He pulled surveillance footage from the gas station, but the tapes from 1998 were long gone, destroyed years ago. Still, the timeline fit. Webb also looked into Pritchard's employment history around 1998. He'd been working sporadically as a handyman. No steady job, no regular income. He'd done work for a few local businesses, but nothing that would have required him to be anywhere specific on October 15. No alibi, no witnesses who could place him somewhere else. Webb requested a search warrant for Pritchard's property. He submitted an affidavit outlining the evidence. The proximity of the burial site to Pritchard's cabin, the soil match, the history of violence and controlling behavior, the lack of alibi, the circumstantial evidence from 1998. A judge reviewed the affidavit and signed the warrant on the 11th of October 2017. The next morning, Detective Webb assembled a team: tactical officers, forensic specialists, AK-9 unit. They were going in prepared for anything. At 6 a.m. on October 12, the convoy rolled out toward Dry Creek Road. Leonard Pritchard was still asleep when they arrived. The tactical team surrounded the cabin. Webb knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. "Leonard Pritchard, Fitchburg Police. We have a warrant." A light came on inside. Footsteps. The door opened a crack. Pritchard stood there in a t-shirt and sweatpants, squinting against the morning light. "What's this about?" Webb held up the warrant. "We have a warrant to search your property. Step outside, please." Pritchard's face didn't change. No surprise, no panic, just a flat, unreadable expression. "For what?" "Step outside, Mr. Pritchard." He did, slowly, hands visible. 2 officers moved in and secured him while the rest of the team entered the cabin. Webb stayed outside with Pritchard. "You know why we're here," Webb said. Pritchard stared at him. "No idea." Dianne Vasquez. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered in Pritchard's eyes. Recognition, fear, something. Then it was gone. "I don't know who that is." "Yes, you do. We found her body. Less than 300 yards from where we're standing." Pritchard said nothing. "We know you killed her. We have evidence, and we're going to prove it." Pritchard's jaw tightened. But he didn't speak. Inside the cabin, the forensic team was tearing the place apart. They collected DNA samples, swabs from Pritchard's toothbrush, his hairbrush, his drinking glasses. They photographed everything. They searched for weapons, for tools, for anything that might connect him to Dianne's murder. In the shed out back, they found a collection of old tools, shovels, hammers, lengths of rope. One of the ropes was nylon, the same type that had been used to bind Dianne's wrists. They bagged it. They also found a lockbox hidden under a workbench. Inside, old photographs, personal documents, and a small brass keyring, blank, no engraving, but the same make and model as the one that had been buried with Dianne. Webb felt the case solidifying. The search took 6 hours. By the time they were done, they'd collected dozens of pieces of evidence. Pritchard was taken to the station for questioning. He sat in the interrogation room, arms crossed, face blank. Webb sat across from him. "You want to tell me what happened? I want a lawyer." And that was it. Pritchard didn't say another word, but he didn't need to. The evidence was going to speak for him. If you're feeling that tension build, go ahead and hit the share button. Stories like Dianne's need to be heard and remembered. Because after 19 years of silence, the truth was finally coming to light, and Leonard Pritchard's carefully constructed life of isolation and secrecy was about to come crashing down. The evidence collected from Leonard Pritchard's property arrived at the State Crime Lab on the 13th of October, 2017. Detective Marcus Webb had submitted a rush request. He knew they were working against the clock. Pritchard had lawyered up immediately, which meant they couldn't question him further. If they were going to charge him with Dianne Vasquez's murder, they needed solid, irrefutable evidence. The DNA samples went to the top of the queue. Forensic analyst Dr. Raymond Chen processed the samples personally. He extracted DNA from the toothbrush, the hairbrush, and the drinking glasses collected from Pritchard's cabin. Then he compared it to the DNA profile extracted from the nylon rope that had been used to bind Dianne's wrists. It took 3 days. On October 16, Dr. Chen called Detective Webb. "We have a match." Webb felt his pulse quicken. "You're sure?" 13 loci match. The probability of it being someone other than Leonard Pritchard is 1 in 4.7 billion. "It's him." Webb closed his eyes. "Thank you." He hung up and immediately called Assistant District Attorney Karen Delgado. "We've got him. DNA match on the rope." Delgado exhaled. "That's enough for an arrest. I'll draft the charges." But Webb wasn't done building the case. A DNA match was powerful, but he wanted more. He wanted a timeline, a motive, a complete picture of what had happened on the 15th of October 1998. He started with the phone records. The call to Dianne's answering service had been made from a payphone on Route 2 at 9:47 p.m. on October 14. Webb pulled traffic camera footage from nearby intersections, but the cameras from 1998 were long gone. And even if they'd existed, the footage wouldn't have been preserved. Still, the location of the payphone was significant. It was 8 miles from Pritchard's cabin, close enough to drive there and back without drawing attention. Webb theorized that Pritchard had made the call, given a fake name, and lured Dianne to his property under the pretense of a repair job. But why? Webb dug into Pritchard's background again, looking for any connection to Dianne. He found none. They hadn't gone to school together, hadn't worked together, didn't have mutual friends. As far as Webb could tell, they'd never met before the 15th of October 1998. So, why target her? Webb considered the possibilities. Random selection? Unlikely. Pritchard had specifically called a locksmith. He'd planned it. Opportunity? Maybe. Dianne was a woman who traveled alone to remote locations for work. She was vulnerable in a way that Pritchard could exploit. Control? That fit with Pritchard's history. His ex-girlfriend had described him as possessive, controlling, someone who didn't handle rejection well. Webb theorized that Pritchard had seen Dianne around town. Maybe she'd done work for a business he frequented, or maybe he'd just noticed her truck with the DV locksmithing logo. He'd fixated on her, decided he wanted to get her alone. So he'd made the call, lured her to his property, and when she arrived, he'd attacked her. It was a theory, but it fit the evidence. Webb moved on to the physical evidence. The soil samples from Dianne's boots had matched the composition of soil found on Pritchard's property, specifically near the shed behind his cabin. Webb requested a more detailed analysis. The lab compared mineral content, organic material, and trace elements. The match was even more specific than they'd initially thought. The soil on Dianne's boots contained fragments of sawdust and wood shavings consistent with the area around Pritchard's shed, where he did carpentry work. That placed Dianne on Pritchard's property. The tools buried with Dianne's body were also significant. Webb had initially wondered why Pritchard would bury them with her instead of disposing of them separately. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. If Pritchard had kept the tools or tried to sell them, they could be traced back to Dianne. If he'd thrown them in a dumpster or a river, they might be found. Burying them with the body ensured everything disappeared together. It was calculated, methodical. Webb also looked at the timeline. Dianne had called her mother around 2 p.m. on October 15, saying she was heading out to Dry Creek Road and would be home by 5. Her truck was found the next morning, abandoned off the road. That gave Pritchard a window of roughly 3 to 4 hours to kill Dianne, bury her body, and move her truck to make it look like she'd been abducted somewhere else. But why move the truck at all? Webb thought about it. If Pritchard had left the truck at his property, it would have immediately pointed to him. But if he moved it a few hundred yards down the road and hid it in the brush, it created confusion. It made it look like Dianne had driven there herself, maybe met someone, and then disappeared. It bought him time, distance, plausible deniability, and it had worked. For 19 years, Webb also examined the weapon. Dr. Tan's autopsy report had indicated that Dianne had been struck multiple times with a blunt object, something heavy and flat, like a shovel or a piece of lumber. During the search of Pritchard's property, investigators had found several shovels in his shed. They'd been collected and sent to the lab for analysis. Forensic examiners looked for trace evidence, blood, hair, tissue, anything that might link one of the shovels to Dianne's murder. But after 19 years, there was nothing. If Pritchard had used one of those shovels, he'd cleaned it, or replaced it. Still, the fact that he had the tools necessary to commit the crime was noted. Webb also looked into Pritchard's behavior in the days and weeks after Dianne disappeared. He interviewed people who'd known Pritchard in 1998, neighbors, employers, people he'd done work for. No one reported anything unusual. Pritchard had gone about his life as normal, worked a few jobs, kept to himself. One neighbor, an older man named Bill Hackett, who lived about a mile down the road, remembered seeing Pritchard driving his truck late one night in mid-October 1998. It was unusual, Hackett said. Leonard didn't usually go out at night, but I saw his truck heading toward the main road around 10 or 11. Didn't think much of it at the time. Webb made a note. That could have been the night Pritchard moved Dianne's truck. Another piece of the puzzle. By late October 2017, Webb had assembled a comprehensive case. Evidence summary. DNA match. Pritchard's DNA on the rope used to bind Dianne's wrists. Soil match. Soil on Dianne's boots consistent with Pritchard's property, specifically near his shed. Proximity. Dianne's body buried less than 300 yards from Pritchard's cabin. Tools. Locksmith tools buried with the body, consistent with Dianne's missing equipment. Timeline. Pritchard had no alibi for the 15th of October 1998. Motive. History of controlling behavior and violence toward women. Opportunity. Pritchard lived in an isolated area, perfect for committing a crime without witnesses. Phone records. Call to Dianne's answering service, made from a payphone near Pritchard's residence. Webb presented the case to ADA Karen Delgado and District Attorney Michael Brennan. They reviewed the evidence, asked questions, challenged weak points. In the end, they agreed. "We have enough," Brennan said. "Let's bring charges." On the 23rd of October 2017, Leonard Pritchard was formally charged with the murder of Dianne Vasquez. First-degree murder, kidnapping, improper disposal of human remains. The arraignment was scheduled for October 26. Webb called Rita Vasquez to give her the news. "Mrs. Vasquez, we've charged Leonard Pritchard with your daughter's murder." Rita was silent for a moment. Then, quietly, "Will he go to prison? We're going to do everything we can to make sure he does." "Good." Her voice was steady, strong. After 19 years of waiting, she was finally going to see justice. On the morning of October 26, Leonard Pritchard was brought into the Fitchburg District Court in handcuffs. The courtroom was packed. Media, locals, Dianne's friends, and Rita Vasquez, sitting in the front row, staring at the man who'd taken her daughter from her. Pritchard stood before the judge, his face blank, his hands cuffed in front of him. The charges were read. "How do you plead?" Pritchard's lawyer, a public defender named Thomas Garrett, spoke for him. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The judge set bail at $2 million. Pritchard couldn't make it. He was remanded to custody pending trial. As he was led out of the courtroom, he glanced once at Rita Vasquez. She stared back, unflinching, and for the first time in 19 years, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The arrest of Leonard Pritchard sent shockwaves through Fitchburg. For 19 years, Dianne Vasquez's disappearance had been the town's most haunting, unsolved mystery. People had theories, suspects they whispered about over coffee, but no one had ever been charged. And now, suddenly, there was an answer. The man who'd lived quietly in the hills for 2 decades, the guy who fixed cabinets and kept to himself, was a killer. The news broke on the evening of the 23rd of October 2017. Local TV stations led with it. Arrest, made in 1998, disappearance of Fitchburg locksmith. Newspapers printed special editions. Social media exploded with reactions. Some people were shocked. Others said they'd always suspected something was off about Pritchard. A few claimed they'd seen him around town and gotten bad vibes, but most people just felt relief. After 19 years, Dianne Vasquez's family finally had answers. Detective Marcus Webb held a press conference the next morning. He stood at a podium in the Fitchburg Police Department's community room, flanked by Chief of Police Daniel Ortiz and Assistant District Attorney Karen Delgado. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Webb raised a hand, and the room quieted. On the 3rd of October 2017, the remains of Dianne Marie Vasquez were discovered during a routine road maintenance project on Dry Creek Road. After extensive forensic analysis, we positively identified the remains and determined that Miss Vasquez was the victim of a homicide. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. Yesterday, we arrested 62-year-old Leonard Pritchard and charged him with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and improper disposal of human remains in connection with Miss Patty Vasquez's death. The evidence against Mr. Pritchard is substantial, and we are confident in the strength of our case. A reporter shouted from the back. "What evidence do you have?" Webb didn't flinch. "I can't discuss specifics while the case is pending trial, but I can tell you that forensic evidence, including DNA, directly links Mr. Pritchard to the crime." Another reporter. "Why did it take 19 years?" Webb's jaw tightened. Miss Vasquez's body was buried in a remote location. It wasn't discovered until the road crew began excavation. Once we had the remains, we were able to apply modern forensic techniques that weren't available in 1998. That's what broke the case open. Do you believe Pritchard acted alone? At this time, we have no evidence to suggest anyone else was involved. What do you say to the family? Webb looked directly into the camera. To Rita Vasquez and everyone who loved Dianne. I know this doesn't bring her back. I know 19 years is a long time to wait for answers. But I hope this arrest brings you some measure of peace. Dianne deserved justice, and we're going to make sure she gets it. The press conference ended. Webb stepped away from the podium, ignoring the shouted follow-up questions. He'd said what needed to be said. Now it was up to the courts. Leonard Pritchard sat in a holding cell at the county jail, staring at the cinder block wall. He hadn't said a word since his arraignment, hadn't shown emotion, hadn't reacted when the judge read the charges or when the bailiff led him away in handcuffs. His lawyer, Thomas Garrett, visited him that afternoon. Garrett was in his late 40s, a career public defender who'd handled everything from DUIs to armed robbery. He was good at his job, thorough, strategic, unshakable. But this case was different. The evidence was overwhelming. He sat across from Pritchard in the small interview room, a folder of documents spread out on the table between them. "Leonard, we need to talk about your options." Pritchard said nothing. "The prosecution has DNA evidence. They have soil samples. They have the proximity of the burial site to your property. They have your history. This is not a case we can win at trial." Pritchard's eyes flicked up. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying we should consider a plea deal. If you cooperate, if you tell them what happened, the DA might take the death penalty off the table. Massachusetts had abolished the death penalty in 1984, but Garrett was speaking hypothetically, trying to emphasize the severity. Pritchard leaned back in his chair. "I didn't kill anyone," Garrett sighed. "Leonard, the evidence says otherwise." "Then the evidence is wrong. DNA doesn't lie." Pritchard's face hardened. "I want to go to trial." Garrett stared at him. "That's a mistake. It's my decision." And that was the end of the conversation. Pritchard was moved to a maximum security unit, where he'd remain until trial. He was placed in solitary confinement for his own protection. High-profile cases like this had a way of making inmates targets, either from people who wanted to make a name for themselves or from those who had their own sense of justice. Pritchard didn't seem to care. He spent his days in silence, staring at the walls, eating alone, refusing to talk to anyone. The guards said he was the quietest inmate they'd ever seen. Outside the jail, the town of Fitchburg was processing the news in its own way. Vigils were held. People gathered in the town square, lighting candles, sharing memories of Dianne. Some had known her personally, others had only heard the stories, but everyone felt connected to her in some way. Rita Vasquez attended one of the vigils. She stood in the center of the crowd, surrounded by people who'd supported her for 19 years. People who'd searched the woods, people who'd kept Dianne's flyers in their windows long after others had taken them down. A local pastor said a prayer. A friend of Dianne's read a poem. And then Rita stepped forward. She didn't have a speech prepared. She just spoke from the heart. "For 19 years, I didn't know where my daughter was. I didn't know if she was alive or dead. I didn't know if I'd ever get answers." Her voice cracked, but she kept going. "And now I know. And it hurts. It hurts more than I can put into words. But at least I know. At least I can bring her home. At least I can lay her to rest." She paused, wiping her eyes. "I want to thank everyone who never stopped looking. Everyone who never stopped caring. You kept Dianne's memory alive. And because of that, justice is finally possible." The crowd applauded. Some people cried. Rita looked up at the night sky, at the stars scattered across the darkness. "I love you, Mija," she whispered. "I never stopped looking, and I never will." Back at the police station, Detective Webb sat at his desk, reviewing the case file one more time. He wanted to make sure everything was airtight. No loose ends, no gaps the defense could exploit. He thought about the 19 years Dianne had been in the ground. 19 years Rita had waited. 19 years Pritchard had walked free. It made him angry, but it also made him determined. This case was going to trial, and he was going to make sure the jury saw exactly what kind of man Leonard Pritchard was. A man who'd lured a young woman to his property under false pretenses. A man who'd killed her, bound her, and buried her like she was nothing. A man who'd lived 300 yards from her grave for 19 years and never said a word. Webb closed the file and leaned back in his chair. The arrest was just the beginning. Now came the hard part, proving it in court. But he was ready, and so was the evidence. Leonard Pritchard had spent 19 years thinking he'd gotten away with murder. But the ground had given up its secret. And now, justice was coming. The trial of Leonard Pritchard began on the 5th of March 2018. 5 months had passed since his arrest. 5 months of legal maneuvering, motions, and pre-trial hearings. The defense had tried to suppress evidence, tried to argue that the DNA sample had been improperly collected, tried to claim that the proximity of the burial site to Pritchard's property was circumstantial. The judge had denied every motion. The trial would proceed. The courthouse in Fitchburg was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Media crews lined the hallway outside, cameras ready to capture every moment. This was the biggest trial the town had seen in decades. Rita Vasquez sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table. She wore a simple black dress and clutched a photo of Dianne in her hands, the same photo that had been on the missing person flyers for 19 years. She'd waited so long for this day. Across the aisle, Leonard Pritchard sat at the defense table, flanked by his attorney, Thomas Garrett. Pritchard wore a gray suit that looked like it had been pulled from the back of a thrift store. His face was blank, emotionless. He stared straight ahead, not looking at the gallery, not looking at Rita, just staring. The judge entered. The Honorable Margaret Calloway, a no-nonsense veteran of the bench with 30 years of experience. She'd presided over dozens of murder trials and had a reputation for running a tight courtroom. All rise. Everyone stood. Judge Calloway took her seat and looked out over the courtroom. Be seated. We are here for the matter of Commonwealth v. Say. Leonard Pritchard. The defendant is charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and improper disposal of human remains. Are both sides ready to proceed? Assistant District Attorney Karen Delgado stood. The Commonwealth is ready, Your Honor. Thomas Garrett stood. The defense is ready, Your Honor. Very well. We'll begin with jury selection. It took 2 days to seat a jury, 12 jurors and 4 alternates. The prosecution and defense questioned dozens of potential jurors, looking for bias, looking for people who could be fair, looking for people who could handle the weight of a murder trial. By March 7, the jury was seated. 8 women, 4 men, a mix of ages, backgrounds, professions. They were sworn in, and the trial officially began. ADA Karen Delgado stood to deliver the opening statement for the prosecution. She was in her early 40s, sharp, confident, and known for her meticulous preparation. She'd prosecuted over 50 felony cases and had a conviction rate that made defense attorneys nervous. She walked to the center of the courtroom and looked directly at the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a young woman named Dianne Vasquez. She was 26 years old, a locksmith, a daughter, a friend. On the 15th of October 1998, she drove into the Massachusetts foothills to do a simple repair job. She never came home. Delgado paused, letting the words sink in. For 19 years, her mother waited, searched, hoped. And for 19 years, the man who killed her, Leonard Pritchard, sat in his cabin, less than 300 yards from where he'd buried her body, and said nothing. She gestured toward Pritchard. The evidence will show that Mr. Pritchard lured Dianne to his property under false pretenses, that he attacked her, that he bound her wrists with rope, that he struck her multiple times in the head with a blunt object, that he killed her, and that he buried her body in a shallow grave, hoping no one would ever find her. Delgado walked over to the evidence table and picked up a clear evidence bag containing the brass keyring. This keyring was found with Dianne's remains. It says DV Locksmithing. It belonged to her, and it was buried with her for 19 years. She set it down and picked up another bag, the nylon rope. This rope was used to bind Dianne's wrists. And the DNA on this rope? It belongs to Leonard Pritchard. She let that hang in the air. The evidence in this case is overwhelming. The DNA, the soil samples, the location of the body, the defendant's history of violence toward women. By the end of this trial, you will have no doubt that Leonard Pritchard is guilty of murder, and we will ask you to hold him accountable. She returned to her seat. The courtroom was silent. Then, Thomas Garrett stood for the defense. He was calm, measured. He knew he was fighting an uphill battle, but he wasn't going to roll over. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution wants you to believe that this case is simple, that the evidence is clear, that my client is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. He paused. But I'm here to tell you that this case is anything but simple. Yes, Dianne Vasquez's remains were found near my client's property. Yes, his DNA was on a piece of rope. But that doesn't prove he killed her. Garrett walked toward the jury. The prosecution will present circumstantial evidence. They'll present theories. They'll present a timeline that might fit. But they won't present direct evidence. They won't present a witness who saw my client commit this crime. They won't present a confession. They won't present a murder weapon. He gestured toward Pritchard. Leonard Pritchard has lived in that cabin for over 20 years. He's a handyman. He uses rope in his work. Is it possible his DNA got on a piece of rope that was later used by someone else? Absolutely. Is it possible that Dianne Vasquez was killed by someone else and her body was dumped near his property without his knowledge? Absolutely. Garrett returned to the defense table. The burden of proof is on the prosecution. They have to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that my client committed this crime. And I don't believe they can do that. Thank you. He sat down. Judge Calloway looked at the prosecution. Call your first witness. Over the next 2 weeks, the prosecution built its case methodically. They called Tommy Briggs, the road crew foreman who discovered the remains. He described the moment his shovel hit fabric, the moment he saw the keyring, the moment he realized what he'd found. They called Dr. Lori Tan, the medical examiner. She walked the jury through the autopsy findings, the blunt force trauma, the ligature marks, the cause of death. They called Dr. Raymond Chen, the DNA analyst. He explained how DNA evidence works, how the profile from the rope matched Leonard Pritchard's DNA, and how the probability of it being anyone else was astronomically low. They called Detective Marcus Webb. He walked the jury through the investigation, the timeline, the evidence, the connection between Pritchard and the crime scene. They called Monica Ruiz, Pritchard's ex-girlfriend, via video link from Arizona. She described his controlling behavior, his refusal to accept rejection, the restraining order she'd filed. Each witness added another piece to the puzzle. The defense tried to poke holes, tried to suggest alternative explanations, tried to create reasonable doubt, but the evidence was too strong. On March 19, the prosecution rested. The defense called only 2 witnesses. The first was a forensic expert hired by the defense, who testified that DNA transfer was possible, that Pritchard's DNA could have gotten on the rope through indirect contact. On cross-examination, Delgado tore the theory apart. She pointed out that the DNA was found in significant quantities, consistent with direct handling, not transfer. The second witness was a character witness, a man who'd hired Pritchard for carpentry work and said he'd always been professional and polite. It wasn't enough. On March 21, the defense rested. Closing arguments began the next day. Delgado stood before the jury one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence in this case is clear. Leonard Pritchard lured Dianne Vasquez to his property. He killed her. He buried her. And he lived 300 yards from her grave for 19 years without saying a word. The DNA doesn't lie. The soil doesn't lie. The location doesn't lie. Leonard Pritchard is guilty, and it's time to hold him accountable." Garrett gave his closing argument, urging the jury to consider reasonable doubt, to question the circumstantial nature of the evidence. But the jury had already made up their minds. On the 23rd of March 2018, after less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood. "We have, Your Honor. What say you? On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty." Rita Vasquez closed her eyes and wept. "On the charge of kidnapping, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of improper disposal of human remains, we find the defendant guilty." Leonard Pritchard didn't move, didn't react. Judge Calloway set sentencing for April 10. And for the first time in 19 years, justice had been served. The 10th of April 2018, sentencing day. The courtroom was packed again. The same faces, the same media crews, the same weight of expectation hanging in the air. Leonard Pritchard was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him. He'd lost weight since the trial began. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, but he still showed no emotion. Rita Vasquez sat in her usual spot, front row, clutching the photo of Dianne. Judge Margaret Calloway entered and took her seat. "Mr. Pritchard, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers on all counts. Before I impose sentence, the law allows for victim impact statements. Mrs. Vasquez, would you like to address the court?" Rita stood slowly. Her hands trembled as she gripped the railing in front of her. She looked at Pritchard. He didn't look back. "My daughter was 26 years old when you took her from me," Rita began, her voice shaking but steady. "She was kind. She was hard-working. She had her whole life ahead of her." She paused, gathering herself. "For 19 years, I didn't know where she was. I didn't know if she was alive or suffering somewhere. I didn't know if I'd ever see her again. Every day, I woke up hoping for answers. Every night, I went to bed with that same hope." Her voice cracked. "You lived 300 yards from where you buried her. You watched us search. You watched me put up flyers. You watched me beg for information. And you said nothing." Tears streamed down her face. "You didn't just take my daughter's life. You took 19 years of mine. You took my peace, my hope, my ability to move forward. But you didn't break me, because I never stopped looking. And I never stopped believing that one day the truth would come out." She wiped her eyes. "I hope you spend the rest of your life thinking about what you did. I hope you never know peace, because my daughter never got the chance to live hers." She sat down, exhausted, and the courtroom was silent. Judge Calloway looked at Pritchard. "Mr. Pritchard, Do you wish to make a statement? Pritchard's lawyer leaned over and whispered something to him. Pritchard shook his head. No, Your Honor. Judge Calloway's expression hardened. Very well. Leonard Pritchard, you have been convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and improper disposal of human remains. The evidence presented at trial was overwhelming. You lured a young woman to your property under false pretenses. You attacked her, you killed her, and you buried her body, hoping no one would ever find out. She paused. For the crime of first-degree murder, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the crime of kidnapping, I sentence you to 20 years to run consecutively. For improper disposal of human remains, I sentence you to 10 years, also to run consecutively. She looked directly at Pritchard. You will spend the rest of your life in prison, Mr. Pritchard, and that is exactly what you deserve. The gavel came down. Pritchard was led out of the courtroom. He didn't look back, didn't acknowledge Rita, didn't show any sign that the sentence affected him. But it didn't matter. He was gone, and he would never be free again. Outside the courthouse, Detective Marcus Webb stood with Rita Vasquez as reporters swarmed around them. Mrs. Vasquez, how do you feel about the sentence? Rita took a breath. I feel like my daughter can finally rest, and I can finally start to heal. What do you want people to remember about Dianne? I want them to remember that she was more than a victim. She was a person. She had dreams. She had a future. And that was stolen from her. But her memory will live on, and justice has been served. Webb stepped forward. I also want to acknowledge the work of everyone who never gave up on this case. Detective Frank Callahan, who worked it from day one, the forensic teams, the road crew who found her, and most of all, Rita Vasquez, who never stopped fighting for her daughter. The press conference ended, and Rita and Webb walked back to the parking lot together. What happens now? Rita asked. Now you get to bring Dianne home, Webb said quietly. Rita nodded, tears in her eyes. 2 weeks later, Dianne Vasquez was laid to rest. The funeral was held at St. Michael's Church in Fitchburg, the same church where Dianne had been baptized as a baby. Hundreds of people attended. Friends, neighbors, people who'd never met Dianne but had followed her story for 19 years. The service was simple but beautiful. A priest spoke about faith, about loss, about the hope of reunion. Friends shared memories, stories of Dianne's humor, her work ethic, her kindness. Rita sat in the front pew, surrounded by family, and listened as people honored her daughter. After the service, Dianne's casket was carried to the cemetery on the edge of town. She was buried under a large oak tree, in a plot next to where Rita would one day be laid to rest. The headstone was simple. Dianne Marie Vasquez, 1972. 1998, beloved daughter, forever in our hearts. Rita stood at the grave long after everyone else had left. She placed a single red rose on the casket and whispered, You're home now, Mija. You're finally home. That night, for the first time in 19 years, Rita Vasquez turned off the porch light. In the months that followed, life slowly began to return to normal. The media moved on to other stories. The courtroom emptied. The headlines faded. But the impact of Dianne's case lingered. It became a reminder of the importance of persistence, of never giving up, even when the odds seem impossible. It also highlighted the advancements in forensic science. The DNA technology that didn't exist in 1998 had been the key to solving the case in 2017. It made people wonder how many other cold cases could be solved with modern techniques. Detective Webb retired in 2019, a year after Pritchard's conviction. He'd spent over 30 years in law enforcement, and the Vasquez case had been one of the most significant of his career. Before he left, he made sure Dianne's case file was preserved, archived, documented, so that future investigators could learn from it. Rita Vasquez continued to live in Fitchburg. She stayed in the same house, the same neighborhood, surrounded by the same people who'd supported her for nearly 2 decades. She started volunteering with a non-profit that helped families of missing persons. She shared her story, offered support, gave hope to people who were living in the same terrible limbo she'd endured. Don't give up, she'd tell them. Keep searching, keep hoping, because sometimes, even after 19 years, the truth comes out. Before we wrap up, drop a comment. What's the weather like where you are today? Let's keep this conversation going. Because stories like Dianne's remind us why we can't stop fighting for justice. Dianne Vasquez's story didn't end with her death. It didn't even end with Leonard Pritchard's conviction. It lived on in the people who remembered her, in the mother who never gave up, in the investigators who kept working the case, in the community that refused to forget. And it served as a powerful reminder: the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Sometimes it takes 19 years, but it always finds a way out. There are cases that haunt us, cases that linger in the back of our minds long after the headlines fade, cases that make us question how something so terrible could happen to someone so ordinary, so undeserving. Dianne Vasquez's case is one of those. She wasn't famous. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't involved in anything dangerous or controversial. She was just a 26-year-old woman trying to make a living, trying to build a life, trying to help her mother. And on the 15th of October, 1998, she drove into the Massachusetts foothills to do a simple repair job. She never came home. For 19 years, her disappearance was a mystery, a question mark that hung over the town of Fitchburg like a dark cloud. People wondered, speculated, hoped, but no one knew. And then, in 2017, a road crew broke ground on Dry Creek Road, and the earth gave up its secret. Dianne's story is a reminder of how fragile life is, how quickly everything can change, how a single decision, answering a phone call, taking a job, driving down a lonely road, can alter the course of a life forever. But it's also a reminder of something else: resilience. Rita Vasquez spent 19 years searching for her daughter, 19 years of not knowing, 19 years of hoping, praying, and refusing to give up. She kept the porch light on. She organized search parties. She called the police every week. She hired private investigators. She put up flyers. She did everything a mother could do. And when most people would have given up, when most people would have accepted that they'd never get answers, Rita kept going. Because that's what love does. It doesn't quit. It doesn't surrender. It doesn't stop fighting, even when the fight seems impossible. And in the end, that persistence paid off. Not in the way Rita had hoped. She didn't get her daughter back. But she got answers. She got justice. She got the chance to bring Dianne home and lay her to rest. And that mattered. Detective Marcus Webb once said in an interview after the trial, "This case taught me that no case is ever truly cold. As long as there's someone who cares, as long as there's someone who's willing to keep pushing, there's always a chance." He was right. The Vasquez case was solved because people didn't give up, because forensic science advanced, because a road crew happened to dig in the right spot, because a mother refused to let her daughter be forgotten. It was solved because the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always has a way of surfacing. Leonard Pritchard is currently serving his sentence at MCI Cedar Junction, a maximum security prison in Massachusetts. He's 69 years old now. He'll die in prison. He's never spoken publicly about the crime, never confessed, never expressed remorse. In interviews, prison officials describe him as quiet, withdrawn, and unremarkable. He keeps to himself, doesn't cause trouble, doesn't interact much with other inmates. He's exactly what he was on the outside, invisible. But his invisibility doesn't erase what he did. It doesn't erase the fact that he lured a young woman to his property under false pretenses, that he attacked her, that he killed her, that he buried her body and lived 300 yards from her grave for 19 years without saying a word. It doesn't erase the pain he caused, the years he stole, the life he destroyed. Leonard Pritchard may be invisible now, locked away in a cell, but his actions will never be forgotten, and neither will Dianne. Dianne Vasquez's legacy lives on in the people who knew her and the people who fought for her. Her mother, Rita, continues to advocate for families of missing persons. She speaks at events, shares her story, and offers hope to those who are still searching. Detective Webb, now retired, occasionally gives talks at law enforcement conferences about cold cases and the importance of persistence. The town of Fitchburg erected a small memorial in Dianne's honor, a bench in the town square with a plaque that reads, "In memory of Dianne Vasquez, never forgotten." And every year on October 15, people gather there to remember her, to light candles, to share stories, to make sure her name is never lost. Because that's what we owe the victims. We owe them our memory, our refusal to let their stories fade, our commitment to seeking justice, no matter how long it takes. Dianne Vasquez was more than a headline, more than a case number, more than a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a locksmith who took pride in her work, a woman who loved her mother and dreamed of a future, and she deserved better than what happened to her. But because of the people who refused to give up, because of the mother who never stopped searching, because of the investigators who kept working the case, Dianne's story didn't end in that shallow grave on Dry Creek Road. It ended with justice, and that matters. There's a question that haunts every true crime story. Why? Why did this happen? Why this person? Why this moment? In Dianne's case, the answer is as simple as it is horrifying. She was targeted because she was vulnerable, because she was a woman who traveled alone to remote locations, because Leonard Pritchard saw an opportunity and took it. There was no grand motive, no deep-seated vendetta, no complex conspiracy, just a predator and a victim. And that's the scariest part, because it means it could have been anyone. It could have been any woman answering a service call, any person driving down a lonely road, any life intersecting with the wrong person at the wrong time. Dianne's story is a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always wear a mask or carry a weapon. Sometimes it's quiet, unremarkable, hiding in plain sight. And that's why we have to stay vigilant, why we have to look out for each other, why we have to keep fighting for justice, even when it seems impossible. Because the alternative, giving up, forgetting, moving on, means the predators win. And we can't let that happen. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to Dianne's story. Thank you for caring. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because every story we tell, every case we cover, is a chance to honor a victim, to seek justice, and to make sure these stories are never forgotten. And if Dianne's story affected you, share it, talk about it, keep her memory alive, because that's how we fight back, not with violence, not with revenge, but with memory, with persistence, with the refusal to let the darkness win. Dianne Vasquez was a locksmith. She spent her days helping people get back into their homes, their cars, their lives. She unlocked doors, and in a way, her story unlocked something too. It unlocked the truth. It unlocked justice. It unlocked the power of a mother's love and the determination of people who refused to give up. Dianne never came home that day in 1998, but 19 years later, she finally did. And her story, her life, her memory, her fight for justice will never be locked away again. Rest in peace, Dianne Vasquez. You are remembered, you are honored, and you will never be forgotten.